on a routine journey from Colombia to the United States. A massive Boeing jet found itself in a dire situation, running out of fuel mid-air. As 77 minutes of delay unfolded above the skies of New York, a deadly combination of wind shear and blizzard conditions battered the aircraft. The captain desperately searched for a safe way out, but they were running out of time and options. What happened to the 158 passengers and crew on board? Was there a chance for survival? Our story begins 35 years ago at Jose Maria Cordova International Airport in Medellin, Colombia. It is the second largest airport in the country and a bustling hub for Avianca, the nation's flag carrier. On the tarmac sits Avianca Flight 052, preparing for its routine international passenger service to John F. Kennedy International Airport in Queens, New York. The aircraft for this long-haul flight is a Boeing 707-321B, registration HK 2016, a true workhorse of the jet age. This particular airframe was manufactured in June 1967 and first served with the legendary Pan Am before being acquired by Avianca in 1977. Powered by 4 robust Pratt & Whitney JT3D3B engines. It was a testament to the golden era of aviation. But after more than 2 decades of diligent service, this veteran aircraft was showing its age. It had accumulated over 61,000 flight hours. A recent technical inspection had noted a persistent issue, a crucial part of the autopilot system. The altitude hold function was unreliable, unable to be repaired in time for the flight. It had been deactivated. This meant the pilots would have to fly the aircraft entirely by hand during critical phases of flight, a task demanding immense concentration and skill, especially in adverse conditions. In command of this aging giant is a seasoned crew of 3 pilots and 6 flight attendants. At the helm is Captain Laureano Caviedes Hoyos, a 51-year-old pilot of immense experience. With over 27 years at Avianca, he has amassed a staggering 16,000 flight hours, with more than 1,500 of those in the captain's seat of a Boeing 707. His record is impeccable, with no history of accidents. He is the epitome of a calm, confident commander. In the right-hand seat is First Officer Mauricio Klotz, 28 years old, a relative newcomer. Klotz has been with Avianca for 3 years and has 1,837 flight hours to his name. Crucially, he is new to the 707, having transitioned to the type recently. He has only 64 hours of experience flying this specific aircraft. He is also the designated crew member for handling English language communications with air traffic control. Rounding out the flight deck crew is flight engineer Matias Moyano, a 23-year veteran of the airline. He possesses more than 10,000 hours of flight time, 3,000 of which are on the 707. His job is to monitor the aircraft's complex systems, most importantly, the fuel. On board, 149 passengers, mostly Colombian and American citizens. Settle in for the journey. The flight plan calls for a 4-hour and 40-minute trip to JFK. The fuel calculations are meticulous. Trip fuel 25 kg. Reserve fuel du 0 second. Alternate airport fuel Boston 300 kg. Holding fuel for delays 200 kilos. Taxi fuel 600 kg. Additional contingency fuel 1,850 kg. The total planned fuel load is a massive 360 kilograms. However, in Medellin, Captain Caviedes makes a command decision, opting to use a different runway for takeoff. He requests an additional 9-10 kilograms of fuel, a small but potentially significant buffer. At 3:08 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, after completing all pre-flight checks, Avianca Flight 052 receives its clearance. The 4 powerful JT3D engines spool up, and the heavy Boeing 707 thunders down the runway, lifting gracefully into the Colombian sky. The first leg of its journey is underway. At 5:28 p.m., the flight entered United States airspace, making contact with Miami Air Route Traffic Control Center. Cruising smoothly at 35,000 feet, the aircraft continues its northward track, later climbing to its final cruising altitude of 37,000 feet, or about 11,300 meters, inside the cockpit. The atmosphere is routine, the conversation is relaxed, everything is proceeding exactly as planned, but unknown to the three men on the flight deck. They are flying towards a meteorological and logistical nightmare brewing over New York. On this particular winter day, a series of powerful storm fronts were converging on the east coast of the United States. They brought with them a maelstrom of high winds, thick fog, and driving snow, creating dangerously low visibility at airports across the region. The epicenter of the chaos was the New York Terminal Radar Approach Control, or NY-TRACON. This single facility is the nerve center for air traffic into the three major New York airports, JFK, LaGuardia, and Newark, as well as 35 smaller airfields in the surrounding area. It is one of the most complex and congested pieces of airspace in the world, under normal conditions. JFK is a model of efficiency. On this day, however, the weather had crippled its capacity. Controllers calculated that the airport could safely handle only 33 landings per hour, a fraction of its true potential. Yet, as of 1:07 p.m., there were already 60 aircraft inbound for JFK. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. The poor visibility forced the closure of runway 22 right, halving the airport's landing capability at a stroke. To make matters worse, the same storm system was battering most of the designated alternate airports. The places where these planes were supposed to go if they couldn't land at JFK were also struggling or closed. The system was backing up. A supervisor at NY-TRACON would later confess to having a dark premonition that afternoon, a feeling that something terrible was bound to happen. Despite the severely reduced capacity at JFK, flights continued to depart from airports all across the country, all heading for New York. By 4:30 p.m., the situation reached a breaking point. 39 aircraft were in holding patterns, circling and waiting for a chance to land. The airspace was saturated. The New York Air Route Traffic Control Center, NYARTCC, which handles high-altitude traffic before handing it off to TRACON, was forced to put arriving aircraft into holds far from the city. For a period, Washington ARTCC, to the south, was unable to transfer any of its New York-bound traffic at all. Some aircraft began diverting to alternates as far away as North Carolina. The system was on the verge of total collapse. This was the environment that the unsuspecting crew of Avianca Flight 052 was flying into. The first sign of trouble for Flight 052 came at 7:04 p.m., while still under the control of Washington Center. They were instructed to enter a holding pattern off the coast of Norfolk, Virginia, for 19 minutes. The Boeing 707 traced lazy ovals over the dark Atlantic Ocean at 37,000 feet, burning precious fuel. At 7:23 p.m., they were finally cleared to proceed, but the reprieve was short-lived. After just 20 more minutes of flight, Washington Center again ordered them to halt. This time, the hold was over Atlantic City, New Jersey, right on the edge of New York Center's airspace. The 707 was forced to circle for another 29 minutes, with every turn. Flight engineer Moyano watched the fuel gauges drop. The crew briefly discussed the possibility of diverting to their designated alternate, Boston's Logan Airport, but for now, they held their course, finally. At 8:12 p.m., they were allowed to leave the hold and make their first contact with the overwhelmed controllers at New York ARTCC.
New York, Avianca 052. Avianca 052, you are cleared to the Cameron intersection. Hold at Cameron. Maintain flight level 190.
The instruction was a blow. Cameron was another holding pattern, a stack of circling aircraft at various altitudes waiting to get into JFK. Flight 052 was being sent to the back of yet another queue. They were instructed to hold there until at least 8:39 p.m. The reason for this further delay was another downturn in the weather at JFK. At 8:35 p.m., the wind had shifted, and visibility had plummeted. More than 20% of the aircraft attempting to land were executing missed approaches because they couldn't see the runway. These go-arounds sent them back into the crowded airspace, compounding the congestion. Inside the cockpit of Avianca 052, the mood was shifting from routine to concerned. The extended holding had consumed a massive amount of fuel. The extra 9-10 keeling of fuel the captain had taken on in Medellin was long gone. Now, their critical reserves were being eaten away. Flight engineer Moyano recalculated their fuel state. The grim reality was clear: they no longer had enough fuel to divert to Boston. Their alternate was no longer an option. They were committed to landing at JFK. At 8:43 p.m., as they continued to circle, First Officer Klotz keyed the microphone.
This is Avianca 052, IL-52. The runway is not yet ready. Please continue to hold until further notice. Maintain 1,000 feet. Avianca 052, roger.
By now, Flight 052 had been holding in 3 different locations for a total of 77 minutes. The fuel situation was becoming critical, realizing they had to force the issue. First Officer Klotz contacted New York ARTCC again. This communication would become the central, tragic focus of the entire incident.
I think we need priority. We are running out of fuel.
The phrase "running out of fuel" is ambiguous to an air traffic controller. It doesn't carry the weight of an official emergency. The controller, juggling dozens of other aircraft, responded with standard questions.
Avianca 052, roger. How long can you hold? And what is your alternate? Yes, sir. We can only hold for about 5 minutes. That's all we can do. 052, what is your alternate airport? It was Boston, but I think it's too crowded now.
Then, a moment later, with more urgency,
It was Boston, but we can't do it now. We are running out of fuel.
as soon as the controller heard the mention of low fuel, he did his job. He placed a 17-second phone call to NY Tracon to see if they could accept the Avianca jet immediately. However, a fatal misunderstanding occurred in that brief call. The ARTCC controller passed on that Flight 052 was low on fuel, but he did not convey the critical fact that the crew had stated they could no longer reach their alternate airport. To the controllers at Tracon, this sounded like a standard low fuel situation, not a dire emergency. They believed the crew still had the option to divert if necessary. They agreed to take the aircraft. NYARTCC immediately cleared Flight 052 to leave the holding pattern and contact Tracon for the weary crew in the cockpit. It seemed their request for priority had worked. They were finally on their way in. They had no idea that the controllers ahead of them perceived their situation as far less urgent than it actually was. With 46 minutes of fuel remaining, Avianca 052 descended out of the holding pattern and headed towards New York, unaware that they were flying into a deadly gap in communication.
New York approach. Avianca 052, we are at 1,000 feet. Avianca 052, thank you. Proceed direct to the Depar intersection.
The crew's hopes surged. They believed they were finally being sequenced for an immediate landing. In reality, the Tracon controller was simply slotting them into the standard arrival queue with every other aircraft. The priority they thought they had was an illusion. The next transmission confirmed it.
Avianca 052, turn right. Heading 220. You'll be making a 360-degree turn. Okay, heading 220. Avianca 052.
A 360-degree turn. It was a standard vectoring maneuver for spacing, but for an aircraft critically low on fuel, it was another devastating blow. For 6 more minutes, the Boeing 707 flew a wide circle, burning more of its vanishing fuel supply. During this turn, they received more bad news.
Avianca 052, be advised. Wind shear reported at 1,500 feet.
In the cockpit, where only First Officer Klotz was fluent in English, Captain Kavides asked what the controller had said. Klotz confirmed the report of wind shear, a sudden, dangerous change in wind speed and direction. Flying through it, especially on final approach and without a functioning altitude hold autopilot, would be a supreme test of airmanship. At 8:48 p.m., they completed the turn and were finally pointed back toward the airport. On the flight deck, flight engineer Moyano, his eyes fixed on the plummeting fuel gauges, pulled out the Boeing 707 abnormal checklist for low fuel. His combination of Spanish and English as he read from it underscored the crew's full awareness of their perilous state. They knew how bad it was. They needed to declare an emergency, for reasons that remain debated to this day. They did not. With the aircraft just 43 kilometers from the airport. A moment of gallows humor broke the tension. The first officer cheerfully told the crew that if they landed in time, they'd be having hamburgers that night. At 5,000 feet, they were cleared to turn onto their base leg. Only one more turn remained before they were lined up with the runway. The aircraft now had just 27 minutes of fuel remaining. If everything went perfectly, the landing would take 17 minutes. The margin was razor thin, descending through 2,000 feet at 9:10 p.m. Flight 052 began its final turn to intercept the localizer, the radio beam that would guide them to the center line of the runway. A minute later, the clearance they had been waiting for finally came.
Avianca 052, you are cleared for the ILS runway 22 left approach.
The pilots began their final approach checklist, but just as they were configuring the aircraft for landing, the wind shear struck. On the ground, instruments recorded a sudden, hazardous change in wind speed over a short distance. The crew had been warned, but they could not have known its true ferocity. With Captain Cavides flying by hand, fighting to keep the heavy jet on the narrow electronic glide path, the aircraft began to struggle. At 9:15 p.m., they were handed over to the Kennedy Tower controller.
Avianca 052, you are number 3 for the runway, following a 727.
A minute later, the tower called again, asking them to increase their speed. The 707 was now just 12 kilometers from the threshold. The captain called for the landing gear. A low rumble echoed through the cabin as the gear extended into the slipstream. The pilots rushed through another checklist flaps to 40 degrees, speed brakes armed. At 9:17 p.m., the final. Welcome words came from the tower.
Avianca 052, wind 190, cleared to land runway 22 left.
But the powerful headwind was playing tricks on them. While their airspeed was correct, their ground speed was much slower than normal, not fully compensating for this. Captain Caviades established a rate of descent that was too steep. "We're below the glide slope," the first officer warned. Tension spiked in the cockpit. They expected to break out of the thick fog and see the runway lights. But there was nothing but an impenetrable gray wall. They were still too far out. The captain fought to bring the nose up and recapture the glide slope. And for a moment, he succeeded. Then, the wind shear viciously asserted itself again. The aircraft's airspeed dropped precipitously. It began to sink rapidly. The ground proximity warning system, sensing the terrifying rate of descent, blared to life.
Sink rate, pull up.
Just not all of her family.
Who pull up?
The captain, his voice strained with panic, yelled in Spanish, "La pista! ¿Dónde está la pista?" The runway. Where's the runway? The cry was echoed by another crew member, in the passenger cabin. The mood shifted from anxiety to terror. People began to pray. Children screamed. The Boeing 707 was just 200 feet above the ground, but still nearly 4 kilometers from the runway. There was no hope of landing. In a last-second, life-saving decision, Captain Cavides slammed the thrust levers to full power and pulled back hard on the yoke, aborting the approach.
Executing a missed approach. Avianca 052. Avianca 052, roger. Climb and maintain 2,000 feet. Turn left. Heading 180.
But what fuel was left to climb the moment the go-around was initiated? The situation transformed from critical to catastrophic. Captain Caviades, now fully aware that they might not have enough fuel for another attempt, shouted at his first officer in Spanish, "Dígales que estamos en emergencia," tell them we are in an emergency. But on the radio, First Officer Klotz's transmission to the tower lacked the one word that would have changed everything. Mayday. We're running out of fuel, the tower controller, still not grasping the gravity, simply reissued the standard missed approach instructions. Roger. Avianca 052 climb and maintain 2,000 feet. The captain, not understanding the English exchange, grew frantic. What did he say? He demanded. He wants us to climb to 2,000 feet. Klotz replied. Well, tell him we are in an emergency, the captain insisted. Did you tell him? Yes, sir, Klotz replied. Tragically mistaken. I already advised him. Whether Klotz believed that saying we're running out of fuel was the same as declaring an emergency, or if the stress of the situation clouded his judgment, the result was the same. The magic words, Mayday, 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 or we are declaring an emergency, were never spoken. At 9:18 p.m., the tower handed the struggling aircraft back to the Tracon controller, the same one who had put them in the 360-degree turn earlier.
Avianca 052, we're climbing to 3,000. Avianca 052, good evening. Climb and maintain 3,000. We are running out of fuel, sir.
Again. The controller heard the words, but missed the desperate subtext. He responded with a new vector that sealed their fate. Okay. 052. I'm going to bring you about 15 miles northeast, and then turn you back for the approach. Is that fine with you and your fuel? 15 miles, 24 kilometers out, and then back again. It was an impossible distance. The aircraft now had only minutes of fuel left. The pilots must have known this. They must have understood that this flight path was a death sentence. Yet, incomprehensibly. First Officer Klotz replied, I guess so. Thank you very much. As the captain and first officer desperately tried to set up their instruments for a second approach, the inevitable began to happen. For the next few minutes, Flight 052 flew on into the dark. Stormy night, a ghost ship running on fumes. At 9:32 p.m., the first engine died. Flame out on engine 4. Flight engineer Moyano cried out in terror. Engine number 4 has flamed out. Seconds later, a second engine sputtered and went silent. Engine number 3 is out, with half their power gone. Klotz made one last, desperate plea over the radio. We just lost 2 engines, and we need priority, please, for the first time. A controller seemed to understand the true horror of the situation. He immediately began vectoring them for the closest possible turn to the runway. Avianca 052 turn left, heading 250. You are 8 miles from the outer marker. Maintain 2,000 until established on the localizer. Cleared for the ILS 22 left approach. They were cleared to land, but it was far, far too late. Within seconds, the remaining 2 engines, starved of fuel, also flamed out. The roar of the jets was replaced by an eerie, whistling silence. The generators quit, and the aircraft lost all electrical power. The radios went dead. The instruments in the cockpit went dark. In the cabin, the lights flickered and died, plunging the 158 people on board into absolute blackness.
But Tiffany had a different strategy. Against the advice of her court-appointed attorneys, she chose to represent herself at trial.
At 9:34 p.m., in the cold, harsh darkness over Long Island, Avianca Flight 052 silently descended from the storm. It clipped a line of trees in a quiet, affluent neighborhood, then slammed into a steep, wooded hillside in the village of Cove Neck. The impact was catastrophic. The fuselage shattered into 3 distinct sections, the cockpit shearing off completely and landing hundreds of feet from the main wreckage. And then, there was only silence, broken by the howl of the wind and the faint, weak cries of the wounded. The first 911 calls flooded the local dispatch centers. Emergency services, racing to the scene, found a surreal and horrific sight. The mangled remains of a massive airliner lay strewn across the hillside. There was no fire, a chilling testament to the fact that the aircraft had, indeed, run completely out of fuel. Inside the twisted metal, dozens of people were crying for help. Firefighters and paramedics climbed into the broken fuselage, pulling out critically injured passengers one by one, among them nearly 20 children and infants. Of the 158 people on board, 73 had perished. Miraculously, 85 survived. The entire flight deck crew, Captain Caviedes, First Officer Klotz, and Flight Engineer Moyano, were among the dead, as were 5 of the 6 flight attendants. A single flight attendant was the only crew member to survive. In a grim footnote to the era, 2 of the surviving passengers were later discovered to be drug mules, carrying pellets of cocaine in their stomachs, a common occurrence on flights from Colombia in the 1990s. The National Transportation Safety Board (NTSB) launched an immediate investigation. The cause of the crash was obvious fuel exhaustion. The question was why? Why did a veteran crew on a routine flight allow their aircraft to run out of fuel over New York City?